Everyone's favorite top 10 channel, Watch Mojo, posted yet another Yu-Gi-Oh video. This time it was titled Top 10 Monsters in Joey Wheeler's Deck, and I want to react to this video because when I watched this for the first time, we watched it on stream, I was like, holy crap, Joey Wheeler had almost no good cards in his deck, because I think out of those top 10 cards, only like 3 of them saw competitive play in the Yu-Gi-Oh TCG. However, on that same live stream, we went through and looked at a lot of different cards that Joey played throughout all the different episodes of anime, and we realized he actually had some pretty decent cards that were competitive in the actual physical trading card game. In today's video, we've done this a couple times, but I want to talk about Joey Wheeler's monster cards and talk about which ones were actually competitive or not competitive in the Yu-Gi-Oh TCG. Please keep in mind that while we are looking at the anime and which cards Joey actually played, we are looking at the cards that he played that actually saw tournament success in the physical trading card game. First up, we have Marauding Captain. So if you're an old school player, you probably remember the Marauding Captain attack lock that would happen when you controlled 2 copies of this card. Basically, each copy of Marauding Captain is a lightning rod for your opponent's attacks on warrior monsters. So if you control 2 copies, they are both trying to take all of the attacks from your opponent's monsters, and because you have 2 of them, your opponent just can't attack anything. And while that combo and that interaction are pretty cool, and we've seen it in a couple other cards as well, like Dupe Frog, Marauding Captain actually saw tons of competitive play within the last 5 years, not necessarily because of that interaction. The big thing here is that Marauding Captain is a level 3 warrior monster, and that gave it a ton of synergy in 2016 alongside Phantom Knights. The Phantom Knight deck is a deck full of level 3 monsters that are also warriors, and pretty much the entire purpose of that rogue strategy was to put multiple level 3 monsters on the field to make pretty powerful rank 3s. We had things like Breaksword and Dante, which obviously wasn't as good as it was in the Burning Abyss deck, but people still played it, and in that deck you oftentimes played Marauding Captain. And like I said, that wasn't the most popular deck out there. It wasn't until 2018 where Marauding Captain, this 10-year-old card, or more than 10-year-old card, is suddenly getting played in a tier 1 meta strategy time and time again, topping and winning some events. This is, of course, when it was getting played in the Goki strategy, which really took advantage of all Marauding Captain's capabilities. Gokis are a deck that wanted to put a bunch of warriors on the field to sort of start their big combos, but Marauding Captain was also super useful because that deck really wanted to make MX Saber Invoker. And what was especially cool about Marauding Captain is that, yes, of course, it's a warrior monster, so you can make Isolde, but you could also, because it's level 3, you could summon it, and then if you had like a hand trap in your hand, like Ash Blossom or Ghost Ogre or anything else, you could then special summon that monster from your hand, and even though those ones aren't actually warriors and you want warriors, you could then overlay those for an MX Saber Invoker to special summon a warrior from your deck and make your Isolde combo happen. Marauding Captain really did fill a crucial role for that deck. It was very, very important in the rank 3 version of Gokis, and that's really one of the things that I love about Yu-Gi-Oh! This card that was printed way back in the day, before Synchros, before Xyz monsters, before Pendulums, before Links, can suddenly come back into the forefront of competition and be a very viable card alongside these newer cards. That's what makes Yu-Gi-Oh! So great in my mind, or one of the things, and Marauding Captain is a great example of it. Now, unlike Marauding Captain, Gearfried the Iron Knight pretty much only saw play in old school Yu-Gi-Oh! And pretty much only for one specific combo that a lot of you have probably already heard about. When you equip Gearfried the Iron Knight with a card, it automatically blows up, and that probably seems like a downside, and in most cases it is. However, there was one specific combo that got a different card banned specifically because of Gearfried the Iron Knight. Butterfly Dagger Elma is an equipped spell card that says, when this card is destroyed and sent to the graveyard while equipped to a monster, this card can be returned to the owner's hand. Now, why does that really matter? I mean, who really cares if you keep adding back that Elma to your hand? What does that actually accomplish? Well, the main problem here is that by having this combination, this 2-card combination, you have an infinite way to use a spell card, and that definitely matters for some specific other cards out there like Royal Magical Library. Royal Magical Library, while it's on the field, each time you activate a spell card, it gets a spell counter, and you can remove 3 spell counters to draw 1 card. Now, as you can see, if you control both Gearfried the Iron Knight and the Royal Magical Library and have an Elma in your hand, you can just infinitely draw out your entire deck, so you could very easily complete Exodia or any other number of FTKs. It did get Elma banned, and that makes sense, right? Konami really doesn't like infinite loops, and while I'm not entirely sure if that combo or a similar combo would actually be played in 2020 if Elma was off the ban list, it looks like Konami doesn't really plan on doing that anytime soon or anytime at all. They just don't want that card in the game. Next up, we have Jinzo, and I do want to say I had to actually ask you guys on Twitter for some clarification clarification on this card. So this card actually was included in the Watch Mojo top 10 list. It's not the only card on my list that was included, but it was one of them. So I figured that it was a card that Joey used in the anime. But when I looked up the sort of episodes that this card was featured in, I noticed that the first couple appearances were actually in another player's deck that then Joey won and used in his own strategy. But it seems like, at least from what you guys said on Twitter and what they said on the Watch Mojo video, that at this point it is very clear to most people that Jinzo is considered to be a Joey Wheeler card, even if he didn't originally own it. So hopefully most of you guys agree with that. It seems like everyone on Twitter did, so hopefully none of you guys watching this video have a problem with me including Jinzo as a Joey Wheeler card, just because it seems like Joey used it a lot of times after he picked it up, so most people associate the card with him, not the original owner. As for the card itself, as most of you guys probably already know because the card is pretty darn iconic, Jinzo negates all trap cards. The level 6 monster with 2400 attack points. Back in the day, this card was limited for about 5 years, so it clearly was a card that people were playing. It was good enough to get on the Forbidden and Limited list, and it was good for a lot of reasons. I think one of the coolest things about a card like Jinzo compared to things like Royal Decree is that Royal Decree can be outed with things like Heavy Storm or Mystical Space Typhoon or Harpy's Feather Duster, where Jinzo is a little bit harder to get rid of. But I also feel that Jinzo as a card, as a monster card specifically, has a huge advantage over other things like Royal Decree, because it means you can revive it and recycle it really easily with some of the old school cards that people were using. Things like Call the Haunted and Premature Burial and Monster Reborn and all of those types of cards can all bring back Jinzo once it hits the graveyard. That makes Jinzo a pretty effective and pretty appealing way to lock down your opponent's back row cards like Mere Force or Torrential Tribute back in old school Yu-Gi-Oh! And it makes sense that Jinzo was so popular that it ended up on the Forbidden and Limited list as a limited card for so many years. And while I'm pretty sure Joey only played this card one time, and in that one instance it actually got negated, he did still have a copy of Fiber Jar in his deck, or at least in his deck at some point. This card is extremely annoying to play against. I'm not really sure if people would actually play it in 2020 if it was unbanned, but it is still a very annoying card. It basically resets the entire duel except for the life points and the banished pile. That made duels back in the day go on for way too long. I've actually talked about this card many times because this card and similar cards like it in other games tend to not go over so well. There's actually a Pokemon card that was very similar to Fiber Jar and actually got emergency banned, which is very unusual and unlikely to happen to a card in Pokemon because that game has set rotation and cards usually don't get specifically banned, they just sort of rotate out. But that card, very similar to Fiber Jar, just caused a bunch of problems at tournaments. Games just aren't meant to go on that long. When you go back even to old school Yu-Gi-Oh! I know people like slower games, but pretty much completely resetting the duel after 10 or 15 turns of play in a tournament setting is just not a very fun thing, so Konami banned this card. I'm not sure if it was really getting abused per se. It's not nearly as powerful as some of the other banned cards, but it was very obnoxious to play against, so it makes sense that Konami doesn't want it in their game. Goblin Attack Force was also pretty good in old school Yu-Gi-Oh! And I think when people are thinking about this card, they sort of associate it with like Skill Drain, and that certainly makes sense because when you have Goblin Attack Force and Skill Drain on the field, the Goblin Attack Force is basically a no drawback level 4 monster with 2300 attack points. Pretty good, but I think this card actually was pretty decent outside of just having it with Skill Drain. Just being a big level 4 monster was pretty valuable back in the day. This next one might be a surprise to some people. The card itself is pretty strange, and that is Neko Main King. So what does this thing do? Why is it so strange? Well, this is a level 1 beast monster with 0 attack and 0 defense, and it says, during your opponent's turn, when this card in your possession is sent to your graveyard by an opponent's card effect, it becomes the end phase of this turn. And that is very specific. Please keep in mind, destroying this thing by battle does not trigger this effect. It specifically has to be by a card effect, which makes it a little bit more tricky to use. The main uses for this card, the reason this card was competitive as a side deck card a few different times throughout Yu-Gi-Oh's history is because when your opponent uses an effect that would discard cards out of your hand, if they hit this card, it immediately ends their turn, which can be pretty valuable in certain situations. For example, one of the earliest uses for this card in a competitive Yu-Gi-Oh side deck was against Delinquent Duo, one of the most popular and powerful cards of old school Yu-Gi-Oh! Delinquent Duo forces your opponent to discard 2 cards. One of them is completely random, one of them they get to choose. So if someone hit you with a Delinquent Duo on the first turn, that was the very first thing they did, they would randomly pick a card and then you would pick a card, and if you had this in your hand, you could choose this one to discard, and even though you're the one choosing it, it is still an opponent's card effect, which just completely ends their turn with nothing on the field in a lot of cases. Later on, this card would be pretty successful against the wind-up strategy that would use Wind-Up Hunter to set up a hand loop. Unfortunately, in that case, all of these sort of cards that were being sent to the graveyard from your hand were completely random, so this card wasn't always the first one that was hit. However, having this card in your hand while your opponent was sending cards to the graveyard with Wind-Up Hunter meant that you at least had a slight chance, or a pretty decent chance, of ending their turn mid-combo. I suppose I should also mention that a few of Joey's fusion monsters did technically see competitive success, things like Flame Swordsman and Thousand Dragon. Now, I say technically because these cards weren't being fusion summoned like 99% of the time in the decks that were even playing them. Basically, back in the day, you had no limit to the amount of fusion cards that you could play in your fusion deck, and people use a card called Metamorphosis, a card that lets you send a monster to the graveyard and then summon a fusion monster from your extra deck with the same level as the set monster. Now, why does this matter? Well, it matters because people would just play 3 copies of pretty much whatever fusion monsters they had access to, including cards like Flame Swordsman and Thousand Dragon. Now, in most cases, in almost all the cases, they would not summon these cards. For example, I found a deck list that had an extra deck full of 117 cards, which, yes, did include 3 copies of Flame Swordsman and 3 copies of Thousand Dragon. Now, realistically, was he ever summoning those cards? Probably not, but why not include them if you have an unlimited fusion deck? I want to say, like I said, these cards were not played because they were good cards, they were just played because they were fusion monsters that existed. But technically speaking, if you go back and look at some old lists that are playing Metamorphosis, you will occasionally find Flame Swordsman and other fusion monsters that Joey played in those deck lists, even if they weren't the most common things to summon. Sort of along the same lines here, we have Time Wizard. So it's a little bit different because this card is not a fusion monster, and it's a little bit different because I think a lot of people actually do remember, like myself, Time Wizard being broken back in old school Yu-Gi-Oh! Like on the playground and stuff, that one guy that always would call the coin toss correctly, but realistically, at actual old school tournaments, this card was not very successful, and it's not really hard to figure out why. I mean, best case scenario, Time Wizard is a Regeki that you have to waste your normal summon on. Worst case scenario, Time Wizard is a card that you have to normal summon and then it blows up your own monsters, and you take damage equal to half the total attack points. So Time Wizard is pretty risky, but what I'm trying to say here is that even when the effect works, it's not very good. Right now in modern Yu-Gi-Oh! We have 3 copies of Dark Hole, we have Regeki, and none of those cards are really played. So attaching those effects to a monster that you have to summon in the first place and half the time just blows up your own monsters is a really, really bad deal, even in older school Yu-Gi-Oh! When Dark Hole and Regeki were being played. So why even bring this card up if it isn't very good? Well, I'm bringing it up because technically speaking, this card does have a couple tops, even if it was only played as a joke. It's still technically topped in those decks. So first up, in March 2016, a Cosmo player got top 8 at a regional qualifier using 1 copy of Time Wizard in his main deck. Now, why did he play that? Probably just for a joke. Obviously, it really doesn't have a ton of synergy. I suppose, technically speaking, you could use it to blow up your own spaceships and summon Cosmos from the deck, but I think it's pretty clear, considering how not good this card is and how many other people didn't choose to play this card in their Cosmo list, that this person was only playing it as a meme, which is perfectly acceptable, but it was technically a top for Time Wizard. And then in November of 2016, so just a few months later, we have a zombie player side decking 2 copies of this for his top 8 regional profile. Once again, it's probably just a joke. Like I said, this card is really, really lackluster at pretty much all stages of Yu-Gi-Oh's history, even more so in the recent years. It kind of reminds me how a bunch of really, really bad and random fusion monsters from old school Yu-Gi-Oh have recent tops in Mystic Mind deck lists. No, those decks can't make those fusion monsters. No, they never intend on making those fusion monsters, but they have to play something for Pot of Extravagance, so they just pick like their favorite cards. So those cards technically have tops, but they really only existed as filler. At least in the case of Time Wizard, I guess it probably was summoned a few times in those tournaments, but obviously it was only played not as a competitively viable option, but just because those duelists chose to play it in their decks as sort of a meme. I know there's a pretty dedicated and loyal fan base of Red Eyes Black Dragon players, so I probably should mention it at least a little bit in this video. The fact of the matter is that the Red Eyes card and the Red Eyes strategy has really not been successful in the Yu-Gi-Oh trading card game, at least at a tournament level. It's a fun casual deck, it has some cool interactions, but in actual tournament play, it's not very successful even as a rogue or underdog strategy. I will say though that the Red Eyes cards have actually performed a lot better in Yu-Gi-Oh! Duel Links than they did in the TCG. It was a top strategy a few different times in that game, so even if the deck and the cards aren't very good in the Yu-Gi-Oh! TCG, the physical trading card game, at least it saw some success in Yu-Gi-Oh! Duel Links, which admittedly does have a limited card pool and skills and some other changes that make the game a lot different from the actual physical card game, but at the very least Red Eyes was pretty competitive in that game, which is pretty cool for Red Eyes fans. Anyway though, that's pretty much all I have to say about Joey Wheeler's cards. I'm sure I missed like 1 or 2 competitive cards, but I think this is like the most competitive of the bunch. I'd also like to give a special shout out to all of you guys that were in the live stream where we went through and picked this list and looked through all the cards that Joey played. You guys were super helpful, as well as the people on Twitter that answered some of my last minute questions while I was editing this video. You guys were great as well. Anyway though, I'll see you guys later. Thank you so much for watching today's video. If you liked this video, make sure you go check out the other ones that I've done about Yugi and Kaiba in a very similar style. I'm sure you'll like those ones as well. I'll see you later though. Thanks so much for watching. Goodbye.